Chapter 36, The Book Revealed. And the word ladder is book, boot, bolt, bold, bond, bone, gone. Norbridge made a low sound, a small gasp, and a cough, and Gracella looked to him. In that split second, Elizabeth felt as though she'd been pinched. Her body came alive again, and she realized Gracella was right in front of her. Elizabeth's muscles unfroze, and she jumped 2 steps back and looked at Norbridge once more. I don't know what you've done, Elizabeth said, but I'm asking you to please stop this. Stop trying to hurt us. Gracella extended an arm in Elizabeth's direction as if to make an accusation. She looked bigger somehow, as though she'd grown several inches or in some inexplicable way expanded her body. Her crown of silver hair and her pale skin and the weird symbols on her black vest made her look foreboding and spectral. Her arm extended toward Elizabeth, and then Gracella's eyes bored into her once more just as she turned away. Look at me, Gracella roared. Look at me. No, Elizabeth yelled. The room filled with a terrible noise like rushing wind, and it was all Elizabeth could do to stand in place, keeping a distance between her and Gracella. She put her hands to her ears and darted to the far side of the room, and then watched as Gracella stood peering at her with perfect calm. The noise stopped, and the room was silent. My daughter Selina discovered where you were, Gracella said, staring at Elizabeth with fury. And once your little flashes of intuition began months ago, she sensed them. And then it was a simple matter for her to locate you, to track you down. She gave your pathetic aunt and uncle money to get rid of you, and she arranged to have you brought here. And all the while, she and Marcus watched you after they brought my body here to wait. Oh, buddy, what's wrong? Oh. Mr.T is home, so he's got Carter, but clearly something made him not happy. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. We needed you, you see, to bring me back and to help us locate something invaluable. She reached inside her overcoat and slid out a guide for children. You were the last of the line, the last one with the power to find the book, and now it's mine. You played right into our hands. You did more than I ever hoped. You brought me back. Elizabeth felt total panic. I don't know what you're talking about. Your dear grandfather does, she yelled. And as he lies there, he can thank you and think about all the years that he slighted me. Elizabeth felt paralyzed. She began to say, but she was so frightened she could barely speak, much less move. Gracella shrugged cruelly. My dear brother is halfway to his end, she said. He can't help you, and there's nowhere to run. She pointed to Elizabeth. I will solve the rest of the puzzle, and after that I will get rid of each of you in turn. But if you know anything at all about this little game our friend Riley Granger created, you had better tell me now, and maybe I'll make things not quite so bad for all of you. Not quite so uncomfortable. She stood watching Elizabeth. I'll give you 10 seconds to tell me what you know. For the first time since she'd entered the room, Elizabeth became aware of the awful smell once again. But she was so overwhelmed with dread for Norbridge that she could hardly think straight. She stood in place, the lines of the strange rhyme in the Granger book sounding inside her. If in your hands you hold the book, it's up to you then, saint or crook. Gracella glared at Elizabeth. Time's up. She pointed at Elizabeth once more, stepped toward her slowly with her arm extended. Elizabeth stood watching, and Gracella was so close Elizabeth could have reached out and touched her gloved hand. It's almost a shame you have to die, Gracella said. You seem like such a resourceful girl. Please don't do this, Elizabeth pleaded. Gracella shook her head sadly, cruelly. Poor girl. You don't have to hurt anyone. Gracella lifted a hand as if to slap Elizabeth. We brought you here to find the book for me. Do you realize your mere presence here increased my power, made it possible for me to finally rejoin my physical form and overwhelm my weakling of a brother? She hesitated. There's just one final piece of the puzzle, and if you don't know it, I may as well kill you right now. But you don't have to do any of this, Elizabeth pleaded. Gracella stared at her with bottomless loathing. She set the book on the reading stand beside her and lifted her hands. There was nothing more to discuss. It was clear what she was about to do. Elizabeth's thoughts were racing furiously. She was trying to think through some way out of this danger, and in that moment, after Gracella set the book down, she realized she had one chance. "I broke the code," she shouted. Gracella lowered her hands. "You figured it out?" "I did." Through her fear, through all the panic and confusion swirling within her, Elizabeth found a small point of calm deep within her mind, the very thing she had been practicing for over a week now. She grabbed onto it and moved her eyes to the book. "I figured it out," she said, even as she focused on the tiny spark of the feeling she was trying to summon. She needed time, anything to gain more time. Gracella hesitated. She seemed to be working out how much she ought to trust Elizabeth. "What do you know?" She cocked her head at Elizabeth. "There's a secret message in the painting of Nestor Falls." Her thoughts were slowing. She let her mind encompass the book before her on the stand as if she was preparing to snatch it up. Gracella lifted her hands and seemed poised to strike Elizabeth. "Go on," she said. The words of the poem throbbed inside Elizabeth's head. "If it's the last, be cruel, be mad, and utter this, I choose the bad. But if the first, calm if you would, intone just this, I choose the good." She stared at the book and let her vision blur. "Go on," Gracella boomed. "And you need a key word to figure it out," Elizabeth said. Her eyes were unfocused and she felt her thoughts quieting. "I know all this," Gracella shouted. "I know all." She stopped, and the shock of her silence made Elizabeth hesitate. The feeling, which had been on the verge of breaking through, tamped down, and she moved her eyes away from the book and to Gracella's harsh face, which was now regarding her with a look of unexpected interest. She seemed to have changed her mind about something. "Not only are you a false," Gracella said quietly, "you really do have some degree of power. Even at your age, I can feel it." She laughed. "And you actually think that you can use it now against me?" She laughed harder. Elizabeth regained her concentration in the midst of Gracella's distraction. She forced her mind to focus on the book, on the feeling, on all the things inside herself. Sorry, I can hear Aiden out the front window crying. "Aiden!" He gets his feelings hurt easily, so we'll see. We'll see what's Mr. T. We'll have to send Mr. T out. Oh. Buddy. He's okay, just in case anyone was worried. Oh, being 4 is super hard, especially when you've decided to just stop napping. So, yeah, there's that. So, if his sister doesn't do exactly what he wants, we have really big fits. So, we don't know if he's broken an arm or if he's just not happy about a decision that was made between the siblings. So, no broken arm. Oh, Oh, she was cackling. Elizabeth regained her concentration in the midst of Gracella's distraction. She forced her mind to focus on the book, on the feeling, on all the things inside herself. "I don't know what you mean," Elizabeth said absently. Gracella laughed even louder. "Very good," she said. "Very, very good. And you have an inclination to practice deception as well. I approve." She leaned forwards. "Perhaps you'd like to use that power of yours to assist me. Imagine that. How wonderful it would feel. The strength of it. And so, yes, I suppose you're correct. Maybe I don't have to kill you. Maybe you would just like to join me." The feeling was on the verge of surfacing more powerfully than ever, but Elizabeth listened to Gracella. As she listened to Gracella, she sensed something unknown within her. A black streak, something jagged and uncanny at the fringes of the feeling, clawed at her. It felt evil and alluring. As she stared at the book and pressed her thoughts tight and heard Gracella's words echoing in her brain, she was stunned by a thought she had never imagined would come to her. What Gracella had said was tempting. Norbridge made a noise again, an anguished, rasping sound, and Gracella looked to him. Some tension in Elizabeth's mind eased a notch, and the wicked feeling of a moment before fled. Her concentration nodded and her gaze bore into the book with a fixity that felt unbreakable. Gracella was still looking away. The book started to vibrate. moved like a pot filled with water just beginning to boil, and then, as if hooked by a line of unseen wire, it lurched off the stand and with a delicate arc landed at Elizabeth's feet. As Gracella turned back to her, she scooped it up, and with both hands wrapped around it, she shouted, "I choose the good!" The crimson light blinked out. Elizabeth held her breath. For several awful seconds, she felt that something had gone awry, that she had done the one wrong thing, and now all was truly and totally lost. Gracella stood motionless, her lips curled and her eyes glazed, and then she looked up quickly and flinched her face. Her face tightened. She hunched over and put a hand to her chest. It looked as though she couldn't gather enough breath to take in. Norbridge was stirring. He let out a low apparently, English is not working out for me today. Sorry, guys. Norbridge was stirring. He let out a low groan and began to stretch his limbs. Gracella reached out a hand to steady herself. She looked vastly different. The white of her face had drained to a sickly gray. The bun of her hair had gone slack, so that her silver strands splayed in a wild tangle, and she seemed to have shrunk into herself. She looked thinner and weaker, as though she'd been struck with some instant wasting sickness. "What's happening?" Elizabeth said, more to herself than to Gracella. "Elizabeth," Norbridge said. He was sitting up and rubbing his shoulder to revive himself. His voice was frail. "Move away from her! Move away!" Gracella, still holding one hand to her chest and extending the other, stumbled forward. Her eyes filled with panic and anger as she made a motion to grab the book from Elizabeth. But as she did so, she lost her balance and fell to the floor and began to flail her arms. First at the air and then at her own body, she thrashed wildly, while her hair and her black jacket and dress flew about. Elizabeth took 2 tentative steps in her direction. "Don't!" Norbridge yelled. He was standing now unsteadily. "Stay away from her!" Gracella gave one terrible final jerk of her body, wailed like an animal, just clutched in a trap that had snapped shut, and lay motionless. One tiny gasp rose up from deep in her chest, and then all was still. Elizabeth looked to Norbridge with utter incomprehension. She turned back to the form on the ground, half thinking Gracella might bolt upright and make a lunge at her, though the other half of her felt certain Gracella wasn't going to stir at all, and never would again. "What just happened?" she said. Norbridge shook his head slowly. "I don't know." He was standing beside her now, studying Gracella the way a person might study some explosive he thinks could still be dangerous. If she's not dead, it seems she's close to it. He looked to Elizabeth. "What happened? I heard something here and came up. That's the last I remember until now. What did you do?" Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, and then without warning, tears flooded her eyes, all of it. The fear of Gracella, the revelations about her mother, the exhaustion of the previous few days rolled over her like a tidal wave, and her body unraveled into deep sobs. Norbridge put his arms around her. "It's too much, I know," he said. "Too much." She cried while Norbridge held her tight. When after a long moment the sobs quieted and she felt she could speak, Elizabeth loosened her grip on Norbridge and leaned away. There was so much she wanted to tell him about the message she had deciphered, and how she had used the power inside herself to move the book, and how she had figured out nearly the entire story of the Himeses and Gracella and even Riley S. Granger, but she figured there'd be enough time for all of that. So instead, she reached for the pendant around her neck and lifted it from under her shirt. "I think Winnie was my mother," she said. Norbridge's face went white. He put a hand to his forehead and stared at the pendant. "Where did you get that?" he stammered. "I've always worn it. My aunt and uncle said it was from my mother." He touched it, ran his finger over the indigo circle of marble. "I gave this to Winnie, and she gave it to me." "Are you okay? Is he okay?" Oh, we got another little boy that needs a nap. Like I said, Mr. T has him, so I'm not just ignoring him. Oh, there's Savannah. Savannah's, she's still working on riding her bike. It doesn't take me much to lose my train of thought. Norbert fixed his eyes on Elizabeth, moved his hand to hold her lightly beneath her chin. You, he began, and then stopped and examined the pendant once more. I haven't seen that necklace since Winnie left. The noise of footsteps and voices, Jackson and others, sounded from beyond the doorway. They were rushing up the stairs. I wear it all the time, Elizabeth said, always. Norbert took the pendant between his thumb and forefinger and held it upright between them. He smiled. This is magic, Elizabeth, he said. Real magic. And then he hugged her once again. Next chapter. Oh, now Aiden's ringing the doorbell. It's a good time to stop.